doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Thank you very much, Xenia, and I think we all are very supportive and inspired by His Majesty's leadership, as we are equally inspired by each and every one of you in this room. I think you're hand-picked, you're doing incredible things, and that you are the momentum and the inspiration, which is why we believe that this new round of NDCs will be transformational. And we believe as the private sector, we have a very important role to play in reshaping the market. Reshaping the market, which will create an opportunity for private capital to flow and be constellated at scale, and for economic growth to be uplifted. So we are very pleased to be able to have this opportunity to convene and learn from each of you, and share some of the new initiatives and ideas that we've been developing within the SMI Africa Council. We have a comprehensive agenda for this afternoon. I know that someone said there's some form of climate meeting happening here in New York. I'm not sure. Everyone seems to be quite busy, which tells me that you place a lot of emphasis on Africa, climate and investment by being in this room. So perhaps let me just share with you what we are looking to cover. First of all, we're going to have some opening keynote remarks from the African Union, the African Union Development Agency, as well as the UN's Economic Commission for Africa. We're then going to have two panels, which will run back to back. The first panel will be on a climate-adjusted asset allocation strategy perspective, and where we'll be looking at African green industrial infrastructure and nature as a globally competitive investable asset class. The second panel will be looking at bankable NDC projects and facilitating what we're describing as, and you'll probably hear this phrase sort of quite a bit, institutional investor public partnerships, which we believe are a really enfranchising framework that can mobilize private capital at scale and deploy that at speed for Africa's just energy transition. We'll have some closing keynote remarks from colleagues from the Great Green Wall Foundation, as well as the African Union Commissioner, who is responsible for the African Union's Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change, CAHOSC. And then we'll hopefully leave you with a little bit more inspiration, because we'll be recognizing some of our public and private sector investment leaders who are really blazing a trail on NDCs through our NDC Investment Awards process. So that's how we'll close out the session. The reality is, as I think we all appreciate, this is a really critical moment. We're going into a Baku for a finance COP. We're going into a nature COP, and we're going into the review and the deposit of new NDCs by February of next year. And people ask, and I was just speaking to the ministers now, we're looking at new NDCs that potentially had a private capital mobilization challenge. And now we've got a new assignment which basically says, raise the ambition. Let's keep everything the same way that it was before, but let's make them more ambitious and expect that we can actually get a different outcome. So we're here today with the solemn belief, and as I said, inspired by each and every one of you, that there's a different way for us to be able to work together. There's a real way to unlock the value of our infrastructure. There's a real way for us to be able to grow a green growth path. And there's a real way for us to be able to compete more equitably in the global green industrial economy, which is a $10 trillion per annum and growing global green industrial economy, which we are less than 2% of that. And I think if you bring long-term institutional assets together with portfolio companies that have domain knowledge and expertise in the key technologies, acting as universal owners where we have interests in both the public as well as the private market, we absolutely believe that this can be a transformational opportunity for all of us. And this comes on the back of, at the 37th African Union Heads of State Summit that we participated in earlier this year, our heads of state have really highlighted and given us a call to action. They talked about the $3 trillion worth of nationally determined contribution projects and investment needs that we have by 2030. And then they did the math. And the math showed that if we continue on our current path, where we're sort of led on private capital mobilization by concessional finance frameworks, there's only going to be about 10% of all of that financing that's actually required to address the $3 trillion from the private sector that can be met. So for the first time, our heads of state called on a new partnership with the institutional investment community that represent over 300 trillion globally of private institutional assets that have a real commitment and interest to drive an equitable, green and just transition. So we're very excited about the African Union's Nairobi Declaration. It is akin to, on many levels, the EU Green Deal or the market signals that were shared through the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think this is, again, a really interesting and unique opportunity for us to be able to partner and collaborate. I know that we hear quite a bit about whether the institutional investment community is really interested in Africa. We're sort of told that the private sector, there's not an alignment of views. I think you'll see from the first panel today, there are no greater, more prolific institutional investment community members or leaders that will not be on that panel. That panel that you're going to see coming up after this opening session collectively represents over $20 trillion of institutional assets. And there are many other places they could have been right now, and they've decided to be here. So I think that that really is a signal about the opportunity that we represent and the partnership that we can enjoy with our good friends and partners. So we have three key objectives for this particular summit. The first is to showcase our investable asset classes initiatives. I think as Zenya mentioned this morning, we showcased our approach to how data is foundational and must be catalytic, because we need to take informed, insightful decisions for institutional allocations. So that was a very useful meeting and session showcasing one of our initiatives. But this afternoon you're going to hear some more. You're going to hear about how we are looking at establishing African green industrial infrastructure as a globally competitive investable asset class, and how we believe on a very practical level all of this value that we have in our nature can be something that governments can use on their balance sheets that will have a number of different positive effects and impacts. One, it will essentially add some value that is not being accounted for currently. And two, we believe that that will also positively improve the cost of capital. And three, managed correctly, which we certainly believe it can be and should be, has the potential to positively impact and influence credit ratings. And we know that those are some real issues that we're looking at the moment. The second of the three issues that we're going to be focusing on today as an objective is to consult and build momentum around our newly formed African Green Tech Demand Coalition and our Philanthropies Lab. We'll be working with key stakeholders from both of those communities to systematize collaboration around project origination, marrying that with long-term and long-duration bankable offtakes between institutional investors, philanthropies, and the private sector in support of the Nairobi Declaration, and our belief and our vision around how we can work together to establish Africa as an investable global green tech manufacturing hub. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're going to be recognizing leaders working on NDC investment opportunities through the NDC investment awards. So I just want to finally take this opportunity to thank our good friends and long-term partners at the CFA Society New York, as always, for being such gracious hosts. Please, let's give them, we're in their wonderful premises. We just had a lovely hospitality from them. And also Xenia, Sustainable Markets Initiative, the work of His Majesty, the partnership, we truly appreciate that. Similarly, our friends and colleagues from the African Union and the African Union Development Agency, and also the NDC partnership. Again, we thank them for their collaboration and their long-term partnership. And you'll see coming out of this meeting, we're actually going to start working much more closely with the honourable ministers to really find new innovative institutional investor-public partnerships to mobilise this private capital and develop some good industrial opportunities. So we're now going to go straight into this climate-adjusted asset allocation strategies panel with a focus on how we can all work together collaboratively to establish African green industrial infrastructure and nature as a globally competitive investable asset class. And everyone is talking about asset classes, but I think the operative words here in the phrase is globally competitive. And we really are saying to ourselves now, if you look at the current arrangements with the sort of public and development finance, that's a $1.5 trillion global collective balance sheet, including the World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Bank, everyone together. But when you look at the private assets, we're talking over 200 to 300 trillion. So that have a very strong interest in our opportunities and our partners. So this is really the conversation that we're having. That's why we've brought together, the global institutional investment leaders to really have this conversation around blended investments. And I think the additional piece that we're bringing into this conversation, linking into the point that I made earlier that was raised by the heads of state, which recognize that the typical concessional capital that, to borrow the phrase, is available or should be directed to de-risk private capital's participation. We believe that there's a new form of strategic partnership that philanthropies, entrepreneurial philanthropies, can play, not necessarily to de-risk, but as we would describe it, to re-characterize that risk. And I think this is some of the innovative thinking that we're going to be calling on colleagues to share and discuss. I think I also mentioned in the opening establishing natural capital and Africa's nature on the balance sheet, and that's something that we're also going to touch on in this session. The climate agenda and the climate movement. We had a very interesting conversation yesterday where we had a philosophical exchange with a party that was basically saying we must go to each and everybody and sell them on the future of climate. And get everyone to make these sort of sacrifices, these early decisions now. And then I sort of interjected, which is why we have Duncan Bonfield on the panel, that the future generation's wealth is with the sovereign wealth funds. And if you can engage the sovereign wealth funds on a mandate around climate, around the sustainable development goals, you can probably speak to 100 institutions or so around the world rather than 7 to 8 billion people. And I think that that's not really fully appreciated or understood. And that's why we believe in the power of long-term institutional capital and the opportunities for everyone to collaborate. Similarly, on the pension funds side, we have the Investor Leadership Network, who have a number of different platforms and commitments as a collective, recognizing that this conversation can only start from scale. We're never going to get in front of this climate scourge or any of these challenges, SDGs, without changing our mindsets to dealing with scale. So I'm very pleased to have our good colleagues from the pension funds and the pension fund community, particularly from the Canadian pension fund community, on this. So let me just explain who they are. So we have Mr. Rich Nuzum, who is the Executive Director for Investments and Global Chief Investment Strategist at Mercer. I know it's a bit chilly, but we always like to just give a little clap. We also have Dr. Martin Stucci, who is the founder and CEO of the Land Banking Group, very innovative on nature. We have Miss Amy Hepburn, who is the CEO of the institution I just referenced, the Investor Leadership Network, the G7's platform for global institutional investors and pension funds. The Future Generations Sovereign Wealth Funds. This is the man that holds it all together. Every single sovereign wealth fund in this world is part of his membership. Mr. Duncan Bonfield, CEO of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds. Gunther Tallinger, who is the chair of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and a member of the board of management of Allianz. Gunther will tell you about the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance himself. They've just had a very good session today as one of their big anniversaries, but it was convened by the UN Secretary General to bring asset owners together to provide leadership on the climate agenda. And then we have, last but not least, Sarah Kehion Williamson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of FCLT Global.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.